test. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our transit special meeting today for the tabling of the budget. Commissioner Milner did send his regrets. He's unable to be here today, but he will be here for when the budget is debated. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, I will pass it over to Mr. Manconi and the management team to take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Members of Transit Commission, we're going to walk you through the draft 2016 Transit Services budget. I want to start off with slide 2, which are some of the essential building blocks that are used in the development of the draft budget that's before you. The three key funding areas that drive transit are customer fares, property taxes, and other revenue, such as charters and revenue from our advertising program. With respect to capital, that's for expansion and renewal. They're funded from property taxes, development charges for some of them, and then also senior levels of government. Mr. Chair, I wanted to include some metrics in the presentation because I know in our discussion we'll probably be touching on some of these. This comes from the CUTA, Canadian Urban Transit Association, which tracks a lot of data for everyone. And the first one on the top left looks at ridership, and it's up there in terms of comparison for our partners Edmonton and Calgary that have light rail. So we're hovering around the 100 million passenger trips. Calgary and Edmonton have had light rail for many, many years. In fact, Edmonton had the first light rail system in all of North America. In terms of a ridership per capita, the one on the top right, that is one that I know my peers, when they look to OC Transpo, they consider us leaders in that a ridership per capita, when you exclude subway operations, Toronto and Montreal, which are high-capacity operations, they're very impressed by that number, as we should all be in terms of a very positive metric. And then on the bottom center is we're middle of the pack on direct operating costs per rider. And obviously, as we move to light rail, our operating costs per rider are driven down. The key budget elements, the first one is a very important piece that is used in the development of our budgets. It's alignment with the Transit Affordability Plan. That is your macro plan that has to be infused into every proposed spending plan that we put before you. We look at all the things that are critical to that plan, capital contributions, revenue cost ratio targets, and so forth. It's your long-range plan that enables you to afford not just rail, but other capital projects and keep the system sustainable from a financial perspective. As you heard, the FEDCO report, the budget directions report, the next two bullets, 2.5% transit levy increase is built in, and the prorated share of 1.3 resulting from growth assessment. The budget is based on 97 million customer trips on our conventional service and 800,000 trips on paratranspo. And our fare revenue is based on $189 million from conventional and $2 million from para. Fare revenue increase is anticipated to generate 2.5% additional revenue, and you'll see how those numbers roll up in a moment. So with respect to transit funding, operating budget for OC Transpo is approaching $500 million, and that's broken down into your operating costs of $390 million, contributions to reserves, which are very, very important in terms of long-range affordability, of $62 million, contributions to our pension, there's a deficit that's being addressed of $0.4 million, and then debt charges, which are also critical to financial sustainability, of almost $38 million. Within that, customer fares generate $190 per the previous slide. Property tax is $261 million, and other revenue, which includes the provincial gas tax, generates $38 million. So now I want to go through the various tranches of the budget, and then at the end there's a roll-up slide that brings it all together in terms of how all this balances out. As you heard this morning from the Treasurer, the Acting Treasurer, the base pressures should be addressed and need to be addressed. And as you know, we're faced with a deficit this year, and it was driven by the expiration of the warranties on our articulated bus fleet, increased insurance claims, and then also looking at our revenue lines to align them with the current ridership that is before us. The next bullets, the annualization of our 2015 service increase. You recall last year we added service, so every year you annualize that. That's standard practice. And same with the annualization of the fare increase that kicked in last July. And then there's an adjustment to the pension plan that's required to ensure it's sustainable. The next piece, worth $9.8 million, these are the costs to maintain service. So there's the 2016 costs of living allowances, increments, and benefit adjustments. There's increase in expenditures for fleet maintenance due to inflation. I want to highlight those are known inflation costs. It's not an across the board. So the management team has to demonstrate they've got signed contracts that have inflation provisions built into it. So we're very particular about that. The third bullet, thanks to our finance department and the great work they're doing with our hedging strategy, you'll see there's some substantial savings on our fuel, and so we're going to benefit from that strategy again this year. There are increased facility expenditures on utility costs and some minor property lease costs. And then there's increase in our contribution to reserves and debt charges, and the Trillium line maintenance costs. We had to retender the maintenance contract, and as you know, there's more trains, more signals, so that there's no significant surprise there. There's increased costs associated with the Trillium line, and that's been built in. So that's $9.8 million to maintain service. With respect to efficiencies and savings, we heard lots about this morning. I want to thank the management team and finance working together. They've identified close to $5 million in efficiencies. These are real. These have been tested in terms of ensuring that they're achievable. The first one is our park and ride lot maintenance. We pay for maintenance, the snow plowing, clearing, and so forth. We're going to bundle up the revenues that we get from that and net out the costs, and the delta will now be charged to the parking reserve, which the treasurer has approved. Our fleet services department has done a very detailed analysis on gapping provisions, and they're reducing their gapping provisions very significantly, along with position realignments. As you heard earlier this year, as part of our expenditure control, we have eliminated management positions, and we also have other positions that we're not filling, and so we're eliminating those positions, and that's rolled up into the $2.4 million. Number three, in addition to the citywide discretionary spending freeze, I've instituted an additional across-the-board reduction, which generates $400,000. This will not affect frontline service, and it's to be implemented as part of the 2016 budget. Our fleet team has identified an opportunity to drive out another $500,000 in efficiencies. They're going to be even more aggressive on the warranty program, and by putting some additional focus on that, they believe they can drive out additional dollars of almost $500,000. And then in terms of service, we need to look at our low ridership routes, and you will see a listing shortly of first and last trips that have very, very low ridership on it. Our recommendation is that you eliminate those first and last trips, and there's a detailed listing by route coming up shortly. That's worth $500,000. With respect to revenue and user fees, as you know, you've heard me say before, the affordability model, fares and taxation need to keep pace and provide the necessary funds for both your operating and your capital purposes. And there's the target of reaching to Council's goal of 55% on the revenue cost ratio that is before us that we need to strive for. So bottom line, fares need to keep pace with costs, and it is troublesome when the revenue cost ratio erodes, so we need to ensure that we do the best we can to keep it either stable or as close to that 55% goal that we can achieve. So with respect to user fees and revenues, in addition to the 2.5 on transit fares, I'm happy to advise that the team has identified other new revenues. I know many of you have talked to me about thinking outside the box, and we're doing that. The first one is new revenues of $1.5 million. There's three elements to that. The TD Place, Red Black, 67s events were a ticket price of the incremental costs, and that's the key word, incremental cost of transit, being included in in the ticket of an event has been a very successful operation. It's very good for transit, it's good for the city, and it's good for those putting out the event. We are targeting large venues and events in the city, and we will, where we can, immediately institute, such as Blues Fest, that the ticket price include the incremental cost of transit as part of that. I can tell you that I've had organizers come to me looking to explore this model because it's a good marketing tool, and the costs are nominal when you look at some of the tickets they're charging. So there's $200,000 that will be coming forward on Blues Fest. I want to thank our planning department and Mr. Scrimger's team. Any new condo that gets built in this city, the developer is required to pay 1 year's worth of transit, and so that's generating $830,000. I've spoken to Mr. Moser. We want to expand that even further, so if there's ideas in that regard in the planning department and the planning rules permit it, Mr. Moser is certainly on side to get even more innovative and drive that number up. And then the last one is the Canadian Tire Centre. Again, this is the incremental cost to provide all those events that are held at the Canadian Tire Centre. This one's a little bit more complex. We have to do a detailed analysis on the site plan and the history of that file to see if we can impose this on them. So that one, the negotiations and discussions will be underway on that one there. So the last piece that we pushed the envelope on, and I want to thank Pattison Advertising. They met with ourselves last week, and we were very direct with them. We're looking for new revenue streams. They've identified a number of ideas that we had not thought about, and so we're putting $300,000 in new revenue, and that's on top of the increased revenue that they've already stepped up and delivered through the new contractual arrangements. So that generates $3.9 million worth of additional user fees and revenue. So how all that rolls up is you have the 2015 base adjustments that I talked about of 7.8. To maintain your service is $9.8 million. There is no growth, there's no expansion to service, and there's no financial capacity to do that. The only thing that exists is the quarterly adjustments that we work with ward councillors and commissioners on to do any adjustments within the budget envelope. Revenue of $4 million, and our savings efficiencies of almost $5 million, and your budget target of $9 million is achieved. With that, we have a budgeted revenue cost ratio of 51.6%. These next, these next number of slides are the low ridership first and last trips. We've listed them by route number. And the way they would work is to implement them, if you approve this, the last day of operation would be Friday, April 22nd. So basically, 2/3 of the year is built into the base budget, and we can certainly provide additional information, as I'm sure many of you will have questions on these in terms of the numbers and so forth. In terms of the transit capital budget, just some highlights: bus refurbishment, vehicle modifications and replacements, over $11 million. Renewal of our operational assets, that's to maintain what we have and keep it in a state of good repair, of $4 million. Improvements to the transitway and other infrastructure of $1.8, and then station, facility, and bus stop improvements and shelters, which many of you put in requests for, of $1.9 million. Some challenges and risks. Again, we've heard the message. You want to know what those risks are. What are the things that we're worried about or concerned about? Changes in the Ottawa economy is something that we need to track, and we do track very, very carefully with our economic development group. Employment levels. You know the relationship between employment levels and transit. We're also looking at downtown building occupancies. We hope that that rebounds back in a positive way and that some of those occupancies are filled up. Very critical to us is decentralization of major employers from the core. We need to also have that on our radar screen, and that could be a risk to the future. Shifts in travel modes. I'm happy to advise that certainly at the CUTA level, Canadian Urban Transit Association level, and other organizations, APTA, transit professionals are now openly and very directly talking about how are shifts in travel mode affecting transit. You know, ridership is down across Canada. I can tell you that. My peers have flagged that to me. They're either flat or down. And so people are looking at more biking, more walking, which is great. You know, that's the hierarchy. We want people to walk and bike. What do other things impact our ridership numbers and our overall revenue? And great weather. I mean, it's been a fantastic fall. So, you know, people are walking and biking more. Again, that's not a bad thing. That's just an impact on the ridership piece. And low gasoline prices, not diesel, but regular gasoline price for, does that encourage people to use vehicles, their personal vehicles, more than they would in the past? In terms of future fares and ridership, we are doing a detailed assessment of our ridership levels. We're looking at where are we, what's our regression curve look like, what are some of those drivers. We're looking at fare pricing and elasticity. That's been raised in this room, and many of you have raised it with me individually, and we're getting some perspectives on those. We're doing a detailed report on those elements, along with what does our fare structure need to be and what our recommendations will be to you when we move to a multimodal operation of bus, rail, electrified diesel, and so forth. And that'll be brought to you in Q1, along with the elasticity, the fare pricing, and a detailed fare table in terms of the impact. So I know a few have already asked me, where's the fare table? It is not in the budget. It will come to you in Q1 as part of the detailed report, and we will have that dialogue with you and seek your recommendations and approval. We'll also include, and again this morning people were asking about the low-income pass, we'll look at the low-income pass options and scenarios, and we'll build that all into one, so what you'll have before you is a detailed report, the issues about pricing, elasticity, ridership trends, analysis across Canada and North America, and how we can fit in the low-income pass, whether it's feasible and what that would look like. So what's not included? There is no capacity, I will say it again, there's no capacity for new service. And I reemphasize that because throughout the year I do get requests for can we add more service, and there is nothing built into the budget. There's no increase in management positions, you know we've reduced those, and there's no other FTEs being requested. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Mr. Manconi. Councillor Cloutier, please.
Thank you, Chair. Merci, Monsieur Manconi, pour la présentation. I had a question about, and Chair, please let me know if this is not high level enough, or if don't hesitate to stop me. The $400,000 pension adjustment, is that, do we think that's all of it? Is this a one-time, or will it be, is it an annual issue?
Yeah, that was as a result of the valuation of the OCT pension plan, and because we are now, the increase in the market value, we don't have to put in the special payment. So there was a reduction from the $5 million to 4.5, so that's the difference. There will be another valuation next year, and so there may be a special payment required then, but for now, for 2016, that is the amount.
Okay. When we do discuss this on December 3rd, or when we discuss it, is it possible to get an estimate of the operating costs per passenger after the LRT will be in operation? Is that, would that be possible?
We're working through all those elements. I can tell you the financial model had operating costs at a high level. That's some of the work that the team's doing right now. I wouldn't have it at the finite level, but I can certainly give you a sense of what the LRT model forecasted.
If we could, just to see the trends. And my last question, and thank you, Chair. The first and last ride savings, $500,000, significant, but I just want to, and we'll discuss it more, the first rides are often for people who are going to, if there was an earlier bus, they would take it. It's because they have to go to a shift at a 5 a.m. shift at a restaurant or something. I would caution whether that's an appropriate place to effect these cuts. Perhaps the second trip of the day on a particular route might be the better place. I know that if we're having a bus driver come in at a certain hour, and then there's the gapping and the filling, but I would caution in terms of a major impact on our on some of the users that first or last ride. Often, I know from personal experience, if if there was an earlier bus, I would have taken it because I wanted to get somewhere, or if there was a later bus, I would have taken it too. So,
Mr. Chair, I encourage that dialogue, so if there's some of those suggestions, because Mr. Scrimgeon and his team have done a very good job of making sure we don't strand people. I understand what you're saying. What we didn't want to do is eliminate the only trip or the only service in certain areas, so he's done a very good analysis of that. That's not to say that we can't adjust some things. At the end of the day, we're going to need about $500,000, and so if there's some ideas or there's a trip within the series of trips that should be looked at, we're very happy to do that. I can tell you he's done a good job. We've engaged the bus drivers to make sure we weren't misreading the data. We also looked at, is anything changing, new business opening up that someone needs to get to and so forth. I encourage that dialogue. We're happy to listen to those suggestions.
looking forward to it. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Cloutier and Mr. Manconi. When commissioners, if you haven't already received the deck, when you do see it, it will have the next trip time on there as well, so you'll see exactly what the gapping is. And many of these routes or many of these trips only have one or two people on them, so that's why they were chosen. Next on the list is Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Manconi. Just a couple of questions related to the deck and the presentation. Maybe I'll start with the fare pricing elasticity, which you say is going to be assessed. I guess the first question is, you must have made assumptions about what the 2.5% fare increase would do to the ridership in 2016 in order to arrive at the $2.2 million in increased revenue figure. So you have actually done, for the purposes of the 2.5, some analysis. So I'm wondering if you can share with the Commission what then is the number of million trips that you're forecasting for 2016, which would give us some sense of what elasticities you're assuming.
Certainly. It all follows the logic that we outlined last year. Remember, we did that detailed presentation at Commission, and so I'll turn over to Mr. Scrimgeon. I don't know if he's got the numbers here with him, but he can give you the methodology.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The concept of elasticity is very well accepted, but not necessarily very well understood in the transit industry, and we're always keen to learn more about it. But the principle is that when the nature of the service changes, the frequency of service, the walking distance to service, or the fares that people pay, or certain other aspects, either improve or reduce, that there will be an effect on demand for transit, all else being equal. Now, all else is never equal, so it becomes a fairly theoretical exercise. Across the transit industry, the view is that ridership with respect to fare change is inelastic, and that is that people do not very much change their habit based on what the fare is. They make that decision based on many other things like congestion and availability of parking and availability of transit service and price of fuel and price of car ownership and things like that. When all else is equal, and as again it never is, the view is that a 1% change in fare different from the other costs that people are perceiving, so in our case difference in CPI, usually results in a 0.2 to 0.4 change in the opposite direction of ridership. So if you had 100 people and the fare went up by 1% more than inflation, you would expect to get 0.3% of another person. So I should have started with 1,000 people. 1,000 people and ridership, went down
100.
by, if you reduced your fare by 1% below inflation, you would expect to get 3 more customers. That's the basic principle. In fact, In Ottawa, we think it's lower than that because compared to other cities, we're a generally affluent city. Compared to other cities, there are relatively few other choices for long-distance trips into downtown. There aren't more parking spaces, there isn't more road capacity, and there hasn't been any more road capacity built for probably over 40 years. So we don't know, but we don't think that fare change makes much of a difference for transit ridership. Now, the proof of that, which is not proof at all, but the indication of that is that during those years that we had 7.5% fare increases 3 years in a row, which I think cumulatively were about a 22% increase, we didn't see any noticeable effect on ridership level at all.
So, sorry, just so that I have some clarity. So the presumption then was a minus 0.3 figure for elasticity or 0?
The transit industry works on 0.2 to negative 0.1 to negative 0.4 elasticity. We think it's lower than that in Ottawa.
In order to arrive at the $2.2 million in increased revenue, you would have had to have come up with numbers to get you there. And that would have had to include an estimate of the number of passenger trips which are going to take place in 2016.
So that is indicated in the presentation, Councillor, at a little over 97 million, I believe.
Mr. Chair, yes, that's on page 4 and the fourth point down.
And so, just so that I understand, you made no assumption that ridership would decline due to a draft 2.5% fare increase. There was no assumption of elasticity in that.
There's no assumption on it. As I say, Mr. Chair, the theory is that if all else is equal, but we know that there's many other things influencing ridership far more than fare level does, and that's what we've briefed you on in the past, that the state of the economy, the weather, and the price of fuel are the major drivers of ridership in Ottawa.
Okay, so 0, just 0, right? 0 elasticity was the assumption. I'm just trying to understand.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. My next question is about the fare table. Mr. Manconi, you said we wouldn't be seeing a fare table at the stage where we're expected to approve the budget. With a 2.5% proposed fare increase, what assumptions should we as commissioners make that will be distributed evenly through the various fare structures, that some may pay more heavily than others? I'm just trying to wrap my mind around how this commission is expected to pass a budget without knowing what the impact is going to be on the actual riders.
So in the past, when there's been a fare increase, it's an average across all the fares, and we do rounding up and down because you don't want to get into the half pennies and so forth. So you can assume that. The only place that would be different is in the where we have contractual obligations, which is with the UPass, where there's they're fixed at 2.5. So that's an automatic, and the rest you could extrapolate and do an average across the fares.
And is that something that you could do for us, just to give us some sense of what it would look like?
Well, so I think, as Mr. Manconi has indicated, there is a more holistic review of the fare structure that is taking place, partly as directed by this commission with a request for a low-income fare product, but also as we transition into light rail, decisions by council have already been made that will dictate and change how the system needs to run. And I think a holistic review and presentation of the fare table will be coming forward in Q1 of next year.
Yeah, I guess the struggle is, imagine we have a resident who says, hey, I see you passed the budget. I use cash. I don't use a Presto card. What is going to be my fare increase? And then I say, you should assume 2.5, but we actually don't know yet. We'll tell you later.
I think you'll see we're going to have a fare table come forward in Q1 of next year, which is at least 3 months before the fare change will come into effect.
But at which point we can't play with the 2016 budget. Okay, that's important. The third and last area I wanted to ask about, just following up on Councillor Cloutier's questions, is Mr. Manconi, you said over the past that the expectation is operating costs for OC Transpo will decline, I guess probably starting in 2019 once you've had a full year of the LRT being in place. Do you have a rough estimate, it needn't be detailed, of what you anticipate the operating costs in rough terms to be in 2019?
I can tell you that the operating budget has to reduce by $16 million, and it will be.
From the 2018, say from the 2017 or 18 figures?
Correct. $16 million is the piece that comes out per the affordability plan of the operating costs.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Egley.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cloutier sort of did cover this in a sense, but I just wanted to follow up on something he had to say about the first and last trips. My concern, and this leads to a question, but my concern is that often the people that are taking the first and last trips, not only because of timing, but also because of finances, don't have a choice. That's how they get to the restaurant or the retail establishment where they have their shift. And I'm working, a lot of them are to places like Bayshore Shopping Centre, Place d'Orléans, places where people are going probably to or from retail jobs, that sort of thing, and that's how they get there. They depend on the bus to get there. So I think we're really good at the numbers, and I say with greatest respect, but sometimes we don't always get the people. We look at it and we say that's 2 or 3 people, and that's a number, but it may be 2 or 3 people that need that bus to get to work. So what I'm going to suggest, based on things that I've heard from residents, is, and maybe you've done this already, and if you have and you've done your due diligence, that's great, but I often hear about trips in the middle of the day, especially ones that aren't going to downtown or whatever, and people saying, they're going by my house, there's nobody on the bus. So is that something that you've looked at as an alternative to maybe where you've got half-hour service or 20-minute service in a community, taking out that bus that goes by at 1:15 in a number, or something like that? Because yes, people will be put off by that, I'm sure, in certain cases, but I think what I'm trying to get at, what Councillor Cloutier is trying to get at, that it's not just about the numbers for those people on the charts, but that's their livelihood. That's how they get to their shift work, the restaurant, the store, the factory, whatever it is. So again, I leave it open to you. If you've looked at the sort of midday rides, let us know. If you haven't, I would appreciate it if you could do that before you come back to us for the discussion on the final approval of the budget.
So, Mr. Chair, I couldn't agree. It is about the people. I mean, they pay the service. We're there for them. Yes, we can look at the alternate trips that Commissioner Cloutier raised. I just caution you on that. When I jump on my 86, there's only 3 people on it, but by the time I get to Tunney's pasture, it's standing room only. So I've heard those stories also. You did do a thorough review of your system a few years ago. This is something that you want to do on a regular basis. Otherwise, your costs can spiral out of control. They are difficult decisions. I understand that. What I would suggest, this is our best professional opinion to you. What I would suggest to you is if you have other trips that you want us to look at, we can certainly do that. There are no obvious ones that have jumped out on us when we did this review, but we're happy to, if you want to explore different trips within routes that you're familiar with or that you want to suggest. We just got to be careful that we don't start spreading it all across the city and impacting multiple wards and so forth. So I'm very open to ideas, and like I said, we're happy to work with the list.
Just for clarification, John, what I was suggesting is, and I get the 86 is a well-traveled, but we have a lot of those little local routes that sometimes during the middle of the day there's not a whole lot of people on there, and if they are using it, it's not for the purposes of getting to their employment. And it's that category that I'd like to know that has been looked at before we vote on this.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just The $11 million deficit we had this year, you were doing it by your savings that you did, plus taking it out of the general reserve, I think, to balance the budget. Was that right?
There's mitigation measures, and the rest comes out of the reserve, correct?
Now, that reserve, the conventional capital reserve that you mentioned here, because what's the difference between the conventional capital reserve and other, there's a different one for LRT, I take it, is it?
I'll just ask the acting treasurer to comment on that.
So that's the one for everything other than LRT. So that, we brought that one down this year to pay that off. Is what we're putting back into it going to meet what was originally in the long-range financial plan to have the money in there for all the things we have to do on capital, or are we going to end up having less capital money available than we were planning?
The work that's before you here today lines up with my opening slides about the capital affordability plan, everything from the fare increases, the contribution to reserves, and so forth. So in the work that we're doing is looking at the 3-year forecast, the big milestone in 2018 when LRT kicks in, and also stage 2 affordability. That's what Mr. Kirkpatrick has had us looking at, including the $16 million reduction in 2018 and so forth. So it's all tied together. The short answer is yes, it's all integrated into that, and we're making sure that we're doing those contributions, and where we're not, we're closing the gap. Hence the 3-year forecast that Council's asked us to look at, and how it all ties in.
Over that 3-year period, we catch up, if I can put it that way, what we took out in 2015.
I'll have to ask the treasurer to comment on that, because the numbers, we continue to work on them.
Sorry, what was the question in terms of 2015?
Well, it's just that we took money out in 2015, but we hadn't planned that in our long-range financial plan. So how are we replacing that over the 3-year term, which we're working on for the overall capital?
I don't have the specifics on that, but we are working on it as part of the overall affordability model. So we are updating that affordability model in early 2016. But I can't answer the specifics.
Okay, well, over time we should get that information then. Related to that a little bit is the $35 million you've got, the money you've got in from the provincial gas tax money. I know we're also funding the LRT with provincial and federal gas tax money. Is the money coming in here being taken away from that, or is this over and above what's going into the LRT? Because we're trying to finance the LRT without going into regular taxes.
Councillor Wilkinson, we're drifting very quickly into very specific questions. Yeah. Perhaps it would be best to formulate them.
I'll give them as notice of that if they could get the answer when they come back on that. The other thing, the increase you have of 2.5%, you said that includes the UPass. Does that also include the annualization of the one from the Algonquin College, because they only had a part year this year, and the next year they'll be having 2 terms instead of 1.
It gets built into the annualization, yeah.
It's in the annualization as opposed to any other place. Okay, fine, thank you. And one final thing, no money for new areas. This is a bugaboo. It's not a problem in my area this year because I've got a bit of service everywhere, but there is a problem when new areas are built out and they're paying full transit levies and they get absolutely no service. And I would hope that when you're doing your adjustments that possibly ends of routes could be made so some of these could get service, because otherwise it's grossly unfair.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Commissioner Crew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of very quick high-level questions. So first of all, with reference to slide number 18 with the future fares, of course I'm happy to see that the assessment and the feasibility of low-income pass will be included at that time. I just want to be clear, is this information to be presented at the same time as the draft fare table for 2016, such that if the recommendation were that a low-income pass was feasible, that it could be in place with the 2016 fare adjustments?
I'm going to say perhaps we have to crunch the numbers. There's a lot of numbers in there, and the low-income piece, it's significant, and so we have to look at how all the numbers work. But it's one report with all the elements in there, and then we would recommend whether we phase it in or when certain pieces would kick in. Our hope is that everything could go in July 1st and do it all in one piece.
So then, once again through the chair, so the information presented with that consideration of future fares may or may not be presented at the same time as the draft fare table for 2016. Is that correct?
No, it'll all be presented together.
Okay, all right. I certainly would like to see that, included at the same time so that if it is feasible, it can be implemented. Secondly, and just very quickly, I'd like to repeat and sort of echo some of Councillor Cloutier's and Councillor Egly's comments with regard to the first and last trips. I certainly recognize that on some of those that have been identified, the ridership is low as 0 or 1, and certainly I think that those are trips that are simply not economical. I also recognize that eliminating instead the second or second last trip may not realize some of the same savings that taking off the first or the last does. That said, and picking up on what Councillor Egly said, I certainly know that I wouldn't be, myself, one of the 10 people on the 131 at 4:03 a.m. if there was any human way that the 446 would suffice for me. So to that end, I wonder if there may be a solution instead of simply canceling the first trips. I recognize that moving trips earlier may inconvenience other people, but that finding a time somewhere in between the two, combining the first and second trip to somewhere in between, because I certainly share Councillor Egly's and Councillor Cloutier's concerns that we may be cutting off those that are economically dependent on getting to a certain employment place at a certain time. Thank you. Those would be my comments.
Thanks very much, Commissioner, and I think that's an excellent idea for us to go and take a look at. Councillor Leeper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A back-to-basics question for me in terms of reading the budget. On page 5 of the detailed budget numbers, there's a column, service initiatives savings. And I just want to reconcile, and this is just as a hypothetical example.
Councillor, that is a hyper-specific question, which is not meant for today.
But it's not this line. I need to understand how there are multiple lines in the under service initiative savings.
It's not clear to me that all the commissioners have received the detailed tables as of yet, and so detailed questions like that are really meant for the debate on the budget. If you need clarity afterwards, I'm sure Mr. Manconi would be happy to answer an email or speak to you off the side, but
it's not line item specific. It's in terms of how to read that column and understand.
If it's about how to read the column, then I'm sure the Finance Department or the appropriate person will be happy to answer the question. If it's about reading the column.
In terms of, so under service initiative savings, there seems to be a disconnect between the efficiencies that are identified in the slide deck and the column. I'm just wondering how to read that column. Are those the efficiencies that they've identified? In some cases, it's not the same as what we see in the slide deck, without identifying a specific line item that could be used as an example. Mr. Chair, those are the savings we've talked about in the deck, and then there's also the prorating of things such as the discretionary spending freeze and things like that, and I'd be happy to walk you through in detail what all those mean. We'll walk through it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Councillor Kakish.
Thank you, Chair. And notice at the end of the presentation you spoke about sort of the ratio and narrowing it down to 51%. I just want to touch a bit on that from a high-level perspective in terms of how we feel going forward to our contributions to the reserves for capital, given the significant investments that are coming up and some stories, that have been out there on that, and in terms of the city contribution, if you can speak to that and reassure us that we shouldn't be concerned in that regards in terms of our contribution.
There's multiple goals, obviously, when you're doing the budget, and one is to present a balanced budget, which we've done. The principles that I outlined at the beginning in terms of the transit affordability plan, there was a lot of rigor that went into that. There's the long view, both the 3-year forecast piece that Council's asked for, and then the longer view about LRT and Stage 2. So those have all been put into place. Are they all perfect? No, but it's all aligned to those principles, and with every year, we're making sure that we're going to bring forward a balanced budget, and as the city manager said this morning, he's confident that we can get there, and transit's no different. We have to get there. We need Stage 1 open, and we want to afford Stage 2. Having said that, there's a lot of parts to the Stage 2 affordability piece, which the city manager has talked about in the past, about an overarching report that will be going to council or FEDCO in terms of Stage 2 affordability. But in terms of where we are now, balanced budget, maintain the key principles in the affordability plan, drive those through, and make sure we always have the long view in front of us.
And do you have an idea or a forecast of when that 55-45 ratio will actually align?
We know where we are. We know we've got challenges in the next 2 years, and when we get to 2017 and 2018 with the opening of the LRT, we have to eventually get to 55% with the opening. It could surpass that. It depends what happens with ridership and other things, but certainly the goal is to get to 55%, and we're close to that at 51.6.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Manconi. Thanks, Chair.
And just on that, we are actually budgeting for a lower revenue cost ratio this year than we budgeted in the 2015 budget by about 1 percentage point. Councillor Nussbaum.
Apologies, Chair. There was just one other thing that I thought might be really useful in terms of being able to study the budget tables between now and our next meeting. I'm wondering if staff could just give us a sense of how they arrived at the $2.2 million figure. So just the basic calculations that went into the estimate that the increased revenues will be 2.2. And it needn't be now. If it's better to send it later, I'm just asking if that could be provided.
We can follow up with you. It's very similar to last year's fare table if you look at the calculations there.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Seeing none, that the 2016 draft operating capital budgets tax and rates supported transit commission be tabled. Is that carried? Carried. Carried. Thank you very much. There are no in-camera items. Are there notices of motion? Seeing none, any inquiries? And we are adjourned. We'll see you at the budget meeting of December 3.